My name is Beatrice, and for 7 years, I believed I was living a beautifully curated textbook fairy tale. I am a 32-year-old architectural archivist, a profession that requires an extreme, near-obsessive attention to minute historical details, structural anomalies, and hidden blueprints. I spent my days restoring old city records, but my nights were spent in a beautifully restored Victorian estate in the historic outskirts of the city. My husband Lawrence was a prominent defense attorney, or at least, that was the prestigious professional shield he held up to the public eye. He was a man of impeccable tailored suits, soft-spoken elegance, and an analytical mind that could dismantle a legal argument in seconds. We were the couple that our neighbors envied. We held quiet dinner parties, donated to local art restorations, and spoke in the gentle, rhythmic cadence of a perfectly harmonious marriage. But a house, much like a human being, always possesses hidden structural fractures. Our home was a sprawling 3-story property built in 1892, featuring high ceilings, intricate crown molding, and an isolated west wing that Lawrence had converted into his private home office. From the very first week we moved into the estate, that specific room was subject to an absolute non-negotiable domestic boundary. The heavy oak door was fitted with a modern biometric digital lock, a stark metallic contrast to the vintage brass hardware characterizing the rest of the house. Lawrence always explained that because he handled high-profile corporate litigation and sensitive state witness testimonies, federal privacy laws mandated that his physical files remain entirely inaccessible to anyone but himself. "It is a clinical necessity, sweetheart," he would always say, kissing the top of my forehead with a warm, comforting reassurance before turning the handle. "The less you know about the monsters I deal with in the courtroom, the safer our home remains." For 7 years, I accepted that narrative without a single question. I took pride in respecting his professional boundaries, focusing instead on my own archival work at the University Museum. But looking back, the subtle anomalies had been accumulating for months, like tiny, imperceptible hairline cracks in a building's foundation. There were the midnight phone calls that he always took while pacing the dense fog of the back garden, his voice dropping to a gravelly, commanding whisper that sounded entirely foreign to the gentle husband I shared a bed with. There were the sudden, unannounced business trips to coastal ports and industrial logistics hubs, trips where he would return with his clothes smelling faintly of industrial grease, ocean salt, and expensive tobacco. The true turning point occurred on a stormy Thursday evening in late October. Lawrence was supposedly 300 miles away in the capital city, attending a mandatory legal seminar on international maritime law. The house was completely silent, save for the rhythmic, aggressive lashing of rain against the leaded glass windows. At approximately 2 a.m., the central heating unit in the basement experienced a sudden mechanical failure, causing a piercing, metallic rattling sound to echo through the ventilation shafts. The noise was unbearable, vibrating through the floorboards of the master bedroom. Knowing that the main control circuit breakers were routed through the West Wing corridor, I put on a warm robe, took a heavy flashlight, and walked down the cold, drafty hallway. As I approached the West Wing, a strange, low-frequency humming sound caught my attention. It wasn't the rattling of the broken heater. It was a rhythmic, electrical buzz coming from directly behind the locked door of Lawrence's private study. I stepped closer, my heart performing a sudden, uncomfortable flutter against my ribs. I pressed my ear against the cold oak paneling. The humming sound was accompanied by the distinct mechanical whirring of an advanced document shredder running on a continuous loop, followed by the faint, muffled sound of a synthetic voice emitting from a high-frequency shortwave radio receiver. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly as they hovered over the biometric scanner on the door handle. Out of sheer, desperate curiosity, I pressed my index finger against the glass pad. The indicator light instantly flashed an aggressive, bright red, followed by a harsh, synthesized beep. Access denied. Unauthorized personnel. I took a step back, the cold weight of suspicion settling deep into my stomach. If Lawrence was 300 miles away in a hotel conference room, who or what was operating inside that room at 2 o'clock in the morning? The piercing beep of the access denial faded into the stormy night, leaving only the dull whir of the document shredder behind the thick wood. I stood frozen in the drafty West Wing corridor, my breath shallow and uneven. My mind raced through every architectural archive I had ever cataloged. I knew this house better than anyone. I had studied its structural transformation from a 19th century single-family manor to the modernized fortress it was today. When Lawrence had the biometric lock installed 3 years ago, he hired a private security firm that specialized in high-end residential defense. I remembered watching the technician wire the unit into the frame. Because the Victorian walls were thick plaster and lath, the technicians had to run an external low-voltage power bypass line through the adjacent linen closet to avoid tearing down the historical crown molding. If that bypass line lost power, the lock was programmed to enter a fail-secure state, drawing from an internal lithium backup battery. However, older models of this specific brand had a documented engineering flaw. During a sudden power surge or thermal fluctuation, the relay switch would delay its transfer to battery power by exactly 4 seconds. During those 4 seconds, the mechanical deadbolt would retract to prevent a fire entrapment hazard. I looked down at the flashlight in my hand, then at the small utility door of the linen closet just 2 feet to the right of the study door. My heart pounded against my ribs, an erratic, terrifying rhythm. I was no longer just a suspicious wife. I was an archivist looking for a structural vulnerability. I stepped into the linen closet, moving aside stacks of Egyptian cotton sheets until I found the small plastic access panel screwed into the drywall. I didn't have a screwdriver, but the edge of my favorite steel pen, the one I used for marking delicate archival papers, was flat enough. I pressed the pen tip into the groove of the plastic screw and turned it with all my strength. The plastic gave way with a sharp snap. Inside the wall lay the neatly bundled wires of the bypass line, glowing with a faint green indicator light on the transformer. Sweat dripped down the back of my neck, despite the chill in the corridor. If I disconnected the main line right now, while the house's central heating unit was already causing an electrical strain on the circuit breaker downstairs, I might trigger the exact 4-second software delay I needed. I gripped the primary plastic terminal block. My hands were shaking so violently I almost lost my grip. What am I doing? I thought. This is Lawrence, the man who brings me lavender tea when I work late. the man I promised to love forever. But the synthetic, monotone voice still murmuring from the shortwave radio behind the wall silenced my doubts. It wasn't the voice of a legal client. It was a coded transmission. With a sharp, downward jerk, I pulled the terminal block out of its socket. The green indicator light died instantly. I dropped the wires, spun around, and sprinted out of the closet to the study door. The digital screen on the biometric lock went completely black. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, a heavy metallic clunk echoed from inside the doorframe, the sound of the deadbolt sliding backward. I grabbed the brass handle, turned it, and pushed. The door swung open into the darkness of Lawrence's private sanctuary. The room smelled intensely of ozone, expensive cedarwood tobacco, and something chemically sharp, like industrial solvent. The only illumination came from the glowing blue light of 3 large computer monitors arranged in a semicircle on his massive executive desk. On the left monitor, thousands of lines of encrypted data were cascading downward in green text. On the middle screen was a live tracking map of a cargo ship moving slowly along the Atlantic coastline, its digital beacon flashing with a cold, rhythmic pulse. But it was the right monitor that made the air completely leave my lungs. It was a live, high-definition video feed of our own master bedroom. The camera angle was high. Hidden perfectly inside the intricate carvings of the ceiling rose directly above our bed. I could see the rumpled duvet where I had been sleeping less than 20 minutes ago. He was watching me. He had been watching my every move, my every restless turn, perhaps for years. A sudden, sharp click behind me caused the hair on my arms to stand up. The internal backup battery of the door lock had finally kicked in. The digital screen on the outside illuminated with a bright blue glow, and the mechanical deadbolt slid back into place with a definitive heavy snap. I ran to the door and pulled on the handle. It didn't budge. The lock was fully functional again, and I was now trapped inside the dark, computerized laboratory of my husband's secret life. The heavy click of the deadbolt locking me inside the room sounded like a gunshot in the silence of the West Wing. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my chest. I lunged at the door, twisting the heavy brass interior handle, but the electronic mechanism completely overrode the manual override. I was locked inside Lawrence's private world, surrounded by the eerie blue glow of the computer monitors and the continuous low hum of the document shredder. I took a deep breath, forcing my archivist training to take over. Panic destroys logical thinking, details save lives. I needed to focus on what was right in front of my eyes. I turned away from the locked door and approached the massive mahogany executive desk. The middle monitor was still tracking the cargo ship. I leaned closer to read the small, crisp text flashing at the bottom of the map interface. The vessel was named the North Star, registered under a maritime company called Alistair Logistics. My mind immediately connected the dots to a historical archive file I had organized 2 months ago for the city's Old Harbor District. Alistair Logistics didn't deal with standard commercial freight. They were an old, private shipping firm that had been liquidated 5 years ago after a massive federal investigation into international smuggling. Why was my husband, a respected defense attorney, tracking a ghost ship on an encrypted military-grade server? I looked down at the desk. Sitting right next to the keyboard was an open, dark leather ledger. Unlike the digital screens, this was physical evidence, something tangible that a defense attorney would never want left around. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I flipped through the heavy, cream-colored pages. The pages were filled with Lawrence's elegant, precise handwriting. There were long lists of dates, monetary values ranging in the millions, and a recurring column labeled brokerage fees. But it wasn't the numbers that made my blood run cold. It was the names written in the final column. They weren't corporate companies or legal entities. They were prominent city officials, high-ranking police captains, and judges, the very people who sat across from Lawrence in the courtroom every single week. Next to each name was a specific date and a single chilling word written in red ink. Secured. "He isn't defending criminals," I whispered into the empty, dark room, the reality crashing down on me like a physical blow. "He is organizing them. He is the architect of the entire network." Suddenly, the document shredder in the corner stopped its mechanical whirring, entering a silent standby mode. The sudden absence of the sound made the room feel even more suffocating. I needed to find a way out before the central heating system cycled back on and the electrical grid reset, which might send an automated security alert to Lawrence's smartphone 300 miles away. I walked over to the tall, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lining the back wall. As an expert in historical architecture, I knew that Victorian homes of this scale often shared an identical design secret: back-to-back fireplaces or shared maintenance flues between adjacent rooms. Lawrence's study shared a wall with the old library lounge, a room that had been out of use for decades. I began running my fingers along the wood paneling behind the heavy, leather-bound law books. I pushed aside volumes of civil procedure and criminal law until my hand brushed against a small, cold iron lever hidden completely behind a thick encyclopedia. With a firm, downward pull, I engaged the mechanism. A soft click echoed behind the bookcase, and a section of the heavy oak shelving slowly swung inward like a hidden door, revealing a dusty, dark passage that smelled of old brick and dry mortar. I had found my escape route. The dark passage gaped open before me like the mouth of a long-forgotten cave. Dust motes, disturbed by the sudden rush of air, swirled lazily in the blue glow emanating from the computer monitors behind me. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the heavy leather ledger from the executive desk, shoved it tightly under my arm, and stepped over the threshold into the secret tunnel. With a careful, backward pull, I clicked the bookcase door shut until the iron lever snapped into place. Instantly, the blue light vanished. I was plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness, surrounded by the heavy, suffocating scent of ancient brick, decaying wood, and dry mortar. My heart was hammering against my ribs so fiercely I could hear it echoing in my ears. I reached into the pocket of my robe and pulled out my flashlight, clicking the switch. A narrow beam of bright white light cut through the gloom, revealing a narrow, steep staircase leading downward into the structural core of the estate. The steps were made of rough-hewn timber, covered in a thick layer of gray dust that hadn't been disturbed for generations. As an archivist, I recognized this space immediately. It wasn't a criminal design. It was a 19th-century servants' passage, structurally engineered to allow household staff to move invisibly between the lower maintenance rooms and the private quarters without disrupting the estate owners. Lawrence hadn't built this tunnel. He had simply discovered it and used it to create an invisible egress from his high-tech fortress. I descended carefully, the old wood groaning faintly under my weight. Every creak felt like a gunshot in the dead of night. After descending about 20 steps, the staircase flattened out into a long, linear corridor running parallel to the house's foundation. The walls here were rough, unpainted brick, sweating with cold underground moisture. I shone the flashlight beam along the floor and stopped dead in my tracks. Unlike the dusty steps above, the dust on this brick floor was heavily disturbed. There were distinct, fresh footprints leading down the corridor, the heavy, structured imprints of men's leather dress shoes, Lawrence's shoes, but next to his footprints were larger, deeply treaded marks left by heavy industrial work boots. My mind raced. Lawrence wasn't just working alone in his study. He was physically bringing people into this house through the dark, under the cover of the night, completely bypassing the security cameras outside. I followed the trail of footprints to the very end of the brick corridor, where the path intersected with a heavy, rusted iron hatch. A modern, heavy-duty padlock was fastened to the latch, but to my absolute surprise, the lock was hanging open, its steel shackle unclicked. Someone had been careless. Or perhaps someone had left it open in a hurry. I pushed a heavy iron hatch upward. It resisted at first, complaining with a loud metallic screech that made me wince before finally swinging open. I scrambled through the opening and found myself breathing in the cold, wet air of the old library lounge. The room was completely dark, the furniture covered in ghostly white dust sheets. I lowered the iron hatch gently, ensuring it made no further noise, and slipped out of the lounge into the main hallway. The house's central heating unit had finally fallen silent, the metallic rattling gone. The power grid had reset, and the soft, familiar amber nightlights of our home illuminated the corridor. I sprinted back to the master bedroom, my breath ragged. I hid the heavy leather ledger beneath the mattress of our bed, slid under the covers, and pulled the duvet up to my chin. My body was trembling uncontrollably, cold sweat chilling my skin. Just as I closed my eyes, feigning sleep, a sudden, sharp vibration cut through the silence. It was my smartphone on the nightstand. I reached out with a shaking hand and checked the screen. It was an automated notification from our home's smart security network. West Wing power anomaly detected at 2:14 a.m. System fully restored. A second later, the phone flashed again. A text message from Lawrence. "Are you awake, sweetheart? I just got an alert about a brief power flicker at the house. Is everything okay?" I stared at the glowing letters on the screen, the blue light reflecting in my wide, terrified eyes. He was 300 miles away in a hotel room, yet he was tracking the electricity of our house with absolute precision. I took a deep, steadying breath, forced my fingers to remain still, and typed back a response. "Everything is fine, love. Just a little storm outside. The heater made a noise, but it stopped. Missing you. See you tomorrow." I set the phone down, turning my face toward the window where the rain continued to lash against the glass. The man I loved, the man I shared a bed with, was a complete stranger. And now I was officially a threat to his empire. The next afternoon, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind a crisp, sunny autumn day that felt entirely deceptive. The bright sunlight streamed through the tall kitchen windows, illuminating the polished marble countertops and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. To anyone looking through the window, I was just a peaceful wife preparing for her husband's return. But underneath the kitchen island, hidden behind the heavy hardwood backing of the pots and pans cabinet, lay the dark leather ledger. At exactly 4:30 p.m., the sound of car tires crunching against the wet gravel of the driveway signaled his arrival. My heart gave a violent, painful thud against my ribs. I stood up, smoothed down my knitted sweater, and forced a warm, welcoming smile onto my face. The heavy front door opened, and Lawrence stepped into the foyer. He looked absolutely pristine. His charcoal wool overcoat was completely dry, his leather briefcase was immaculate, and his silver-rimmed glasses caught the afternoon light. He looked exactly like the brilliant, law-abiding defense attorney the city respected. "Hello, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying that familiar, rich baritone warmth that had comforted me for 7 years. He stepped forward, opening his arms to wrap me in a tight embrace. As I pressed my face against his shoulder, my senses instantly went on high alert. The comforting scent of his expensive cedarwood cologne was there, but beneath it, sharp and undeniable, was the smell I had encountered in the hidden study last night. The chemical odor of industrial solvent and raw ozone. My stomach twisted into a tight knot, but I held on to him, forcing my body to relax into the hug. "I missed you," I whispered, pulling back to look into his eyes. I searched his face for any sign of suspicion, any hint that he knew I had breached his digital fortress. His expressions were perfectly calm, his eyes bright and affectionate. He was an expert actor, a man who spent his life manipulating juries and hiding structural truths. The seminar was incredibly tedious. Lawrence sighed, removing his overcoat and hanging it neatly in the foyer closet. Just hours of listening to retired judges argue about maritime container regulations. I am thoroughly exhausted. How was your weekend with the archives? Quiet, I lied smoothly, walking back to the kitchen to pour him a mug of coffee. I spent most of Saturday indexing 19th century residential zoning permits for the Harbor District. It was historical, slow work. Lawrence took the mug from my hand, his fingers brushing against mine. His touch was steady. "Ah, the Harbor District, a fascinating area of the city. So much history buried under those old docks." He took a slow sip, his eyes tracking my face with an intensity that suddenly felt terrifying. "You didn't have any more issues with the electricity last night, did you? That automated alert quite worried me." "No, not at all," I replied, keeping my voice light and steady. "The wind just knocked a branch against the external power line, I think. The lights flickered for just a brief second, and then everything reset. I went right back to sleep." Lawrence nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. "Good. Excellent. This old house has character, Beatrice, but its infrastructure can be unpredictable. I think I might have the security team come out tomorrow just to run a clinical diagnostic check on the system. We can never be too safe." A cold sweat broke out across my lower back. If his security team ran a diagnostic check, they would see the physical bypass wire in the linen closet had been disconnected and reconnected manually. They would know the system didn't experience a natural flicker. They would know someone had intentionally created a glitch to bypass the biometric lock. "That sounds like a smart idea, love," I said, turning my back to him to wash a dish so he wouldn't see the sudden panic in my eyes. "I'll be in my study for an hour to catch up on some case files before dinner," Lawrence said, picking up his briefcase. "Don't wait up if you get hungry. I watched him walk down the corridor toward the west wing. As his figure disappeared around the corner, my hands began to shake so violently the porcelain plate I was holding slipped from my fingers, splashing soapy water across the counter. The clock was ticking. I had less than 24 hours before his security technicians arrived to expose my tracks. I needed to decipher the secrets in that leather ledger tonight, or I would become the next casualty in Lawrence's criminal empire. Dinner that evening was a masterclass in silent psychological warfare. We sat at opposite ends of the long mahogany dining table, the soft glow of the chandelier casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. Lawrence spoke calmly about a new corporate client, his demeanor perfectly poised, while I nodded, smiled, and forced down small bites of food that tasted like ash in my mouth. Every time his silver fork clicked against the porcelain plate, it felt like a countdown timer echoing in my head. By 11 p.m., the house had finally settled into a fragile silence. Lawrence had gone to sleep early, claiming his long trip had completely drained his energy. I lay beside him in the master bedroom, staring at the intricate plaster rows on the ceiling, completely aware that a hidden lens was capturing my every movement. I waited for 2 agonizing hours until his breathing became deep, heavy, and rhythmic. Slowly, sliding an inch at a time, I slipped out from under the duvet. I didn't dare turn on a light. Moving purely by memory and touch, I crept downstairs to the kitchen, retrieved the dark leather ledger from behind the pots and pans, and slipped into the old library lounge through the main hallway. I sat on the floor behind a dust-sheeted sofa, completely shielded from the doorway, and clicked on my small archival pen light. I opened the ledger to the pages filled with names of city officials, police captains, and judges. As an archivist, I knew that complex networks always utilized a specific organizational methodology. Lawrence was a legal mind. He wouldn't just write arbitrary numbers. There had to be a system. I studied the columns carefully. Next to each name was a 9-digit alphanumeric sequence. For example, next to Judge Henderson's name, the code read AL-04-22-92. I leaned closer, the paper pattern looking strangely familiar. My eyes widened as a realization hit me. 92. Our estate was built in 1892. A.L. Allister Logistics, the ghost shipping company. April 22nd. April 22nd. It's not a legal file code, I whispered, my heart racing. These are cargo container registration numbers and arrival dates. Lawrence wasn't just bribing these officials with cash. He was coordinating the arrival of illegal shipments through the Old Harbor District, and these prominent city leaders were providing legal immunity and police protection for the cargo. The column labeled brokerage fees didn't represent money paid to them. It represented their percentage of the smuggled goods. He had documented the entire supply chain of the city's underground network in his own handwriting. Suddenly, a floorboard groaned sharply in the hallway just outside the library lounge. I instantly clicked off the pen light, plunging myself into darkness. I held my breath, pressing the heavy ledger against my chest as my ears strained to catch the slightest sound. The heavy, measured footsteps of a man walking in socks slowly approached the lounge door. Beatrice? Lawrence's voice cut through the dark, sounding cold, clear, and completely devoid of his usual warmth. Sweetheart, I woke up and the bed was cold. Are you down here? I squeezed my eyes shut, my body freezing in absolute terror. The beam of a smartphone flashlight suddenly cut through the doorway, sweeping across the dusty furniture sheets. The light bounced off the walls, creeping closer and closer to the back of the sofa, where I was curled up on the floor. If he walked 3 steps into the room, the light would expose me, the ledger, and the truth. The smartphone flashlight beam swept across the dust-covered armchair just inches from my hiding spot. I stopped breathing entirely, pressing my back against the hardwood base of the sofa, clutching the leather ledger to my ribs like a shield. My heart was pounding so hard against my chest wall, I was certain Lawrence would hear its frantic rhythm. "Beatrice?" His voice called out again, closer this time. The casual, loving husband tone was completely gone, replaced by a flat, calculating cadence. "I know you're not in the kitchen, and the security grid tells me a door in this hallway was opened 10 minutes ago." I heard the soft swish of his socks moving across the antique Persian rug. He was stepping further into the library lounge. The light beam bounced off the ceiling rose, casting long, monstrous shadows of the sheeted furniture across the floorboards. I closed my eyes, preparing for the inevitable moment the light would hit my face. Suddenly, a loud, sharp thud echoed from the far corner of the room, followed by the sound of a hollow object rolling across the floor. Lawrence spun around instantly, the beam of his flashlight snapping toward the secret iron hatch behind the heavy drapes. "Who's there?" he hissed. Taking advantage of the split second his back was turned, I slid silently along the base of the sofa, slipping out of the room's side exit that led into the conservatory corridor. I didn't look back. I moved like a ghost through the glass-walled hallway, the moonlight guiding my steps, until I reached the main staircase. I flew up the stairs, slipped into the master bedroom, shoved the ledger under my side of the mattress, and dove under the duvet. 3 minutes later, the bedroom door opened slowly. I kept my eyes closed, forcing my breathing into a slow, deep, rhythmic pattern. I felt the mattress sink slightly as Lawrence sat down on his side of the bed. He didn't get under the covers immediately. He just sat there in the dark, the cold air from the hallway clinging to his clothes. I could feel his gaze burning into the back of my neck. "You're a heavy sleeper tonight, sweetheart," he murmured softly into the dark room. I didn't move a muscle. I didn't answer. After a long, agonizing silence, he finally lay down, but neither of us slept a single wink for the rest of that terrifying night. By 8 a.m., the traps were fully set. The kitchen was quiet, but the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Lawrence was sitting at the breakfast bar, calmly reading the morning legal transcripts on his tablet, looking as pristine and untouchable as ever. The sound of a heavy diesel engine idling in the driveway broke the silence. The security technicians had arrived. "Ah, that will be the diagnostics team," Lawrence said, setting his coffee cup down with a deliberate click. He stood up, smoothing his tailored suit jacket. "I'll go let them in. They need to check the wiring in the West Wing linen closet first." "Actually, Lawrence," I said, my voice remarkably steady as I stepped into the foyer behind him, "they don't need to look at the closet, because I already know exactly how the system glitched." Lawrence stopped tracking his tablet. He turned around slowly, his silver-rimmed glasses catching the harsh morning light. His face was a completely unreadable mask. "What are you talking about, Beatrice?" "I know about the North Star," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the high ceilings of the foyer. I know about Alistair Logistics. I know about Judge Henderson, the police captains, and the cargo containers coming through the old harbor district. For the first time in 7 years, I saw a hairline crack in my husband's flawless composure. His left eye twitched imperceptibly, and his hands tightened into fists at his sides. Beatrice, you are letting your imagination run wild with old archival records. You need to step away from the historical files. It's not an imagination, Lawrence. It's a paper trail, I replied, pulling the dark leather ledger from behind my back and holding it up between us. In your own elegant, precise handwriting. I spent the night scanning every single page and transmitting the alphanumeric codes directly to the Federal Maritime Trade Commission and the Internal Affairs Division. Lawrence's expression instantly darkened. The charming husband vanishes entirely to reveal the cold, predatory criminal underneath. He took a predatory step toward me, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low growl. You foolish woman! Do you really think those federal agencies aren't already on my payroll? You have just signed your own eviction notice from this house. Give me the ledger. He lunged forward to grab my wrist, but before his fingers could brush my skin, the heavy front doors of the estate were violently smashed open. A dozen armed federal agents clad in tactical gear with FBI stamped across their chests, flooded into the foyer, their weapons raised and aimed directly at Lawrence's chest. Federal Bureau of Investigation! Drop to your knees! Hands behind your head! A commanding voice boomed through the space. Lawrence froze, his hands hovering in midair. He looked at the agents, then looked back at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of absolute shock and burning fury. How? He hissed. The city officials. They control the local warrants. The local police are corrupt, Lawrence, but the Federal Maritime Task Force isn't, I said, stepping back as 2 agents tackled him to the polished marble floor, forcing his arms behind his back and clicking the steel handcuffs into place. As an archivist, I don't just look at old records. I look at federal jurisdictions. You built a perfect criminal network, but you forgot that a building always collapses when the foundation is rotten. As the agents led him out of the front doors into the bright autumn sunshine, he didn't look like a powerful defense attorney anymore. He looked small, exposed, and utterly defeated. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, surrounded by the very monsters he had spent his career organizing. I stood alone in the grand, quiet foyer of the Victorian estate, looking down at the dark ledger in my hands. The fairy tale was officially over, the secrets were exposed, and the house was finally silent. I was no longer just the wife of a brilliant man. I was the architect of my own freedom. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to Storyline English. See you next time.